The temp nurse moved through Seattle General in Savannah like a ghost with a badge, the kind of invisible that took years to perfect. Rachel Torres, no one called her by her first name, most didn't know it, kept her head down during night shifts, inserting herself into the rhythm of the cardiac ward with the precision of someone who understood that attention was a liability. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that particular way of hospitals at midnight, and the antiseptic smell burned in her nostrils with each breath, sharp enough to sharpen focus. Her scrubs were standard navy, her name tag printed in small letters that caught almost no light, and the 14-year-old son's school photo in her locker sat next to something else, a small folded flag from Kandahar, worn at the edges from being touched before every shift, a ritual no one would understand if they asked. Which no one did. That was the point. She had been at Seattle General for 8 months, cycling through temporary assignments that kept her moving, kept her from accumulating the kind of professional history that required explanations or background checks that went deeper than the sanitized file they had on her now. Captain Rachel Torres, officially deceased in a convoy accident 14 years ago according to the Pentagon's classified records. The same Pentagon that had made it clear she could never surface without risking prosecution, never acknowledge what she had been or what she had done. So she pushed a medication cart with the steady precision of muscle memory, documented every procedure in meticulous detail, and made sure that no one in this hospital ever had a reason to look too closely at her hands. Those hands moved now, reaching for a bag of pretzels in the vending machine at the end of the third-floor corridor. Quarter after quarter, she inserted them into the slot with the kind of mechanical focus that came from not thinking about anything else. Her fingers were steady, not the kind of steady that suggested nervousness being suppressed, but the actual steadiness of someone whose hands had stitched soldiers together under mortar fire. When she rolled up her scrubs, the scars were there if anyone bothered to look, burn marks from an IED blast near FOB Shank in Loga province, shrapnel pocking her left forearm like a road map to a place she was supposed to have died. 3 feet away, 2 nurses stood talking, their voices pitched just high enough to carry. And then he said, the taller one, Jennifer, mimicked Mercer's voice with exaggerated condescension, her chin lifted, her tone dripping with barely concealed contempt. The medication timing in Torres's charting shows a fundamental lack of understanding of cardiac protocol. Jennifer's voice hit that particular register that made mockery sound like gospel truth. The other nurse, Marcus, laughed, not a kind laugh. He was newer, still junior enough to think bullying up the hierarchy made sense. Did he actually say a fundamental lack of understanding, or is that just how Dr. Mercer's voice sounds in your head? No, that's actually how he talks, Jennifer said. Everything is a deficiency. Everything is wrong. He stood there during grand rounds yesterday with like 20 residents watching, and he literally used her charting as the example of what not to do. Jennifer's face twisted into a theatrical expression of distaste. Her hands were shaking the whole time. Did you see that? She couldn't even. Rachel's hands did not shake. That was the first problem with Jennifer's account. Her hands remained exactly as they were, steady on the vending machine slot, steady as they had been in Kandahar when she placed a 14-gauge needle between fractured ribs while rounds were coming in from the north compound. Her jaw tightened, just imperceptibly, the smallest muscular contraction at the hinge. Nothing visible unless you knew what to look for. Her expression stayed blank, the kind of blank that came from professional training, from understanding that any visible reaction was an opening for more. She retrieved the bag of pretzels and turned to face them directly. Jennifer and Marcus froze for a moment, both of them suddenly aware they had been talking about someone who was standing close enough to hear every word. Rachel looked at them both, not angry, not sad, not anything readable. She simply looked at them the way a person might look at a meal they had already decided against eating. My apologies, Rachel said quietly, moving past them toward the break room. Her voice was soft, deferential, the voice of someone who accepted that she had a place in the hierarchy and it was somewhere near the bottom. I didn't mean to interrupt. Jennifer's face flushed slightly, that particular embarrassment that comes from being caught being unkind, and Marcus suddenly became very interested in the water fountain down the hall. Rachel continued forward without checking whether they were following, without waiting for an apology or an explanation. She simply moved through the space as if she had not just heard herself described as incompetent by two people who barely understood the difference between a central line and a PICC line. The break room was empty at 11:06 p.m., which was precisely when Rachel had timed her break to occur. She sat at the plastic table with the bag of pretzels and her phone, scrolling through messages from her son's school about an upcoming science fair while her other hand rested flat on the table, demonstrating a steadiness that would not waver. The trembling that Jennifer had described, that was not there. The trembling was something Rachel had learned to suppress so completely that it no longer existed except in other people's imaginations. Fear was information. Anger was data. Both were filed away in the same compartment where she kept everything about who she had actually been. A call came through the intercom system at 11:52 p.m., the clinical voice of the ER tech cutting through the humming lights. Cardiac unit, we have an incoming patient. 62-year-old male, Air Force colonel, presenting with acute coronary syndrome. ETA approximately 8 minutes. Rachel was already moving before the announcement finished. The break room chair slid back with a soft scrape against the linoleum. She disposed of the pretzels without thinking, washed her hands with the methodical precision of someone who understood that cleanliness was the first rule of not killing people, and positioned herself at the cardiac unit nursing station by the time the paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the double doors. The colonel was breathing hard, his face the particular shade of gray that meant his heart was struggling significantly with the electrical signals it was receiving. Crushing chest pain radiating down the left arm, classic presentation, textbook to the point of being almost straightforward. Rachel moved to help position him in the bed, her hand steady on the railing, her movements efficient and minimal. One of the paramedics, a man with the weathered face of someone who had spent time deployed, looked at her as she reached for the patient's arm to establish and fall line. His eyes paused on her hands, on the precise way she was preparing the 18-gauge needle, the angle of her forearm, the muscle memory that was visibly present in every movement. He froze for just a moment, recognition playing across his features like light through water. "You were in Kandahar," he whispered, the words meant only for her, his voice barely above the hum of the cardiac monitor that was already clicking into rhythm on the colonel's chest. The paramedic's name tag read Graves, and his eyes held the particular kind of knowing that came from having seen things most people would not survive. Rachel's jaw tightened again, that imperceptible muscular contraction. Her expression remained absolutely blank, her hands continuing their work without any interruption in their rhythm or precision. She did not look at the paramedic. She did not acknowledge the words he had spoken. She simply continued placing the needle with the kind of surgical certainty that came from having done this 1,000 times in circumstances that would have broken most people, and her eye stayed fixed on the fall line as it slipped smoothly into the colonel's vein, the catheter advancing with a soft click that only someone trained would recognize as correct. The colonel's oxygen saturation was holding at 87%. His heart rate was elevated but not yet chaotic. The EKG showed the particular pattern of a man whose cardiac system was under siege but not yet defeated. Rachel moved through the admitting process with the kind of quiet competence that made her seem almost unremarkable, just another temp nurse doing her job with technical accuracy but nothing more. No one would have guessed that every single movement was informed by 14 years of suppressed expertise, by a captain's rank that no longer officially existed, by hands that had once been trusted with decisions that determined whether people lived or died on the other side of the world. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway 7 minutes later, his white coat crisp and his expression already arranged into something that resembled clinical assessment but carried the particular weight of a man who enjoyed demonstrating his authority. He glanced at Rachel's charting on the tablet without really seeing her, and his jaw tightened in exactly the same way Rachel's had, though for entirely different reasons. Her documentation was meticulous, vitals every 60 seconds, medication administration logged to the minute, the four-placement technique noted with precision that left no room for interpretation. It was the kind of charting that would make it difficult for anyone to claim procedures had been done differently than they actually were. Which was precisely why Mercer had started keeping notes about her work. Which was precisely why he was already building a file about her performance that contained carefully selected examples of her supposed failures, documentation violations that he had been manufacturing for the better part of 3 weeks. But that was not Rachel's concern yet. At this moment, Her only concern was the colonel in the bed, the man from the 455th who had once known what she was, whose presence was now complicating everything she had worked to establish about her own invisibility. She continued working without acknowledging any of it, her hand steady, her voice soft when she spoke, her entire presence the careful construction of someone who understood that the past had a way of reaching into the present if you were not vigilant about keeping it buried. The room went dead silent when the colonel opened his eyes and looked at Rachel's hands holding the 4-line, recognition flickering across his face like a light being switched on behind his eyes. He did not speak. He simply looked at her with a kind of understanding that suggested he had just realized he was being cared for by someone he had believed was dead. Rachel's expression remained blank. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and the particular antiseptic staleness that accumulates in hospital spaces where nothing ever opens. 20 residents crowded the tiered seating, their notebooks already open, pens poised like they were about to receive scripture. Rachel stood against the back wall, near the door, where she always stood. Where nobody noticed her. Where she needed to be. Dr. Mercer pulled up the first chart on the overhead screen. Her chart. The medication administration record glowed white against the dark background, timestamps highlighted in yellow. "Let's discuss what happens when protocol isn't followed," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone he reserved for teaching moments, the tone that suggested the room was filled with disappointing children. Nurse Torres administered the beta blocker at 0600 instead of 0800. "Can anyone tell me why this is problematic?" A resident in the third row raised her hand nervously. "Inconsistent timing affects steady-state plasma concentration." "Exactly." Mercer's smile had no warmth in it. "This kind of freelancing, temp staff who think they know better than attending physicians, is how patients die. It's how we lose licenses. It's how we lose lives." He turned to the screen and circled the timestamp with his laser pointer, the red dot pulsing like a heartbeat on the wrong part of the rhythm strip. "Nurse Torres, you're here." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She said nothing. Her hands were completely steady, hanging at her sides like weapons someone had temporarily holstered. "Perhaps you could explain your reasoning." Mercer's voice dripped condescension the way antiseptic drips from a wound. "Patient. Disappointed. The way you might address someone who had failed at something simple. The medication timing was actually correct. The patient, Colonel Hartley, had a custom cardiac protocol due to his compromised renal function. Rachel had verified it against the most recent nephrology consult, cross-checked the pharmacy notes, and followed the modified schedule to the letter. The residents didn't know this. Mercer knew this. The silence in the room had weight to it, like humidity before a storm. Rachel met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked down at her hands and said nothing at all. Mercer held the moment like a director holding a stage light. "I think what we learn here," he continued, turning back to the residents, "is that credentials and confidence are not the same as competence. Experience matters. Hierarchy exists for a reason." The laser pointer circled the timestamp again. "When we cut corners, we pay consequences." Nobody in the room looked at Rachel. That was the architecture of public humiliation, everyone studiously avoiding her face while being painfully aware of where it was. One resident actually took a note. Rachel watched her write something in neat cursive, documenting the critique, filing the lesson away as evidence of her own superiority by proximity. The presentation continued. Another chart. Another moment of critique directed at someone else. Rachel stopped listening to the words. She listened instead to the sound of his voice, the particular register he used when he was establishing dominance over a room. It was a voice she recognized. Not from this hospital. From somewhere else. From a time when men who sounded like that had held her life in their hands and decided, without consulting her, that she was expendable. The grand rounds lasted another 40 minutes. Rachel remained against the back wall, her expression blank as drywall, her breathing so controlled it barely registered. When Mercer finally released the residents, dismissing them back to their rotations with the air of a general sending troops to their posts, Rachel waited until the room had mostly emptied before she moved. She took the back stairs. 2 hours later, she was standing in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor, inserting quarters with fingers that belonged to someone who had sewn up compound fractures under mortar fire. The metal slot accepted the coins without comment. Rachel made her selection with the same precision she brought to everything, calculated, measured, final. She didn't hear them at first. The 2 nurses rounded the corner from the break room, already mid-laugh, the particular quality of laughter that stops being funny the moment someone realizes the joke was at their expense. 0600 instead of 0800, one of them, Jessica, who worked nights in pediatrics, said in an exaggerated high-pitched voice that somehow managed to sound both theatrical and cruel. "How am I supposed to know which protocol the patient needs? I'm just a temp nurse." "Freelancing temps," the other one laughed. "That's what I love about Mercer. He just says it. Just calls it out right there in front of everyone." Rachel retrieved her coffee from the machine. The cup was warm, which was something. She turned to walk past them, her face composed as a photograph, her eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the wall. They stood 3 feet away, and as she passed, they didn't try to hide the satisfaction in their faces. The kind of satisfaction that comes from successfully positioning yourself just outside someone else's radius of pain. Rachel's hands didn't shake. Not then. Not while they were watching. She didn't respond. Didn't flinch. Didn't offer the gift of acknowledgement that would have made the moment feel earned. She simply walked past them with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The hallway fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she moved through them, disappeared around the corner, and headed toward the stairwell. The shaking happened later. Much later. Alone. At 1847 hours, Dr. Mercer pulled her into his office. The space smelled like expensive cologne and the particular staleness of doors that stayed closed too long. His desk was mahogany or something meant to look like mahogany. There was a photograph of his family in a silver frame, 3 children, a blonde woman in tennis whites, a golden retriever. The image of someone who had learned early that love was something other people provided for you, like housekeeping or private school tuition. "I'm concerned about your cultural fit here at Seattle General, Torres," he said, and he used her last name the way some people use a door they're about to slam shut. "Maybe this placement isn't right for you." He slid a folder across his desk. Rachel opened it without being invited to. 3 incident reports. Each one meticulously documented. Charting discrepancies. Minor errors he'd been manufacturing for weeks, collecting them like samples in a lab. The documentation was his weapon, and it was far more dangerous than a blade. "One more notation issue," Mercer continued, "and I'll have to involve HR. I'd hate to see security escort you out." He said it like he would genuinely hate it. Like it would actually pain him to watch her dignity walk out of the building in small pieces. Rachel closed the folder and met his eyes. She said nothing. Her silence was harder than glass. "You understand the position you're in?" he asked. She stood up and left the office without answering. The door closed behind her with a soft click, not a slam. That was the thing about silence, it could deliver more information than words ever could. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was used for storing compression devices and extra gauze. It was small, windowless, protected from view. Rachel sat on an upturned crate for 3 minutes and let her hands shake. That was all the time she allowed herself. 3 minutes to feel the weight of what was happening. 3 minutes to remember that she'd survived worse than this. Then she stood up, ran cold water over her wrists at the nearest sink, and went back to work. At 01 for 7 hours, the alarm started. It wasn't a code bell. It was worse. It was the full cardiac arrest sequence, the kind of alarm that travels through a hospital like electricity through wire, lighting up every system at once. Rachel was already moving before her conscious mind registered the location. The colonel. The combat medic who recognized her hands. The man from the unit she wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The crash cart rolled toward the cardiac ward with the kind of urgency that made everything else stop. Monitors screaming. Multiple voices calling out vitals. The colonel's chest was rising and falling in the wrong rhythm, his oxygen saturation plummeting like a stone down a well. 91. 84. 78. The number kept dropping, and the room kept moving, and Rachel's muscle memory took over completely. She inserted the emergency line with the kind of precision that came from stitching up soldiers under fire. The needle went in. The line flushed. Another nurse, Petty Officer Mitchell, she remembered him from the 455th, watched her hands with the specific intensity of someone who had just recognized impossible things. "You were in Kandahar," he whispered, so quietly only she heard. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She continued working without acknowledging the words, without acknowledging that her past had just solidified in the room like ice forming on still water. The colonel's oxygen saturation was still dropping. Nothing else mattered. Not Mitchell. Not the voice she heard underneath the clinical language of crisis. Not the understanding that everything was about to change. By 02:47 hours, 12 doctors had gathered in that room. One by one, they stepped forward, assessed, consulted their clipboards, and stepped back. The numbers they cited were clinical. The conclusions they reached were merciful. No one wanted to continue extraordinary measures on a patient with an advance directive that explicitly requested comfort care in terminal situations. "His lung is collapsing under pressure," someone said. "We've exhausted resuscitation options," someone else added. "Time to call it." 12. The specific number kept accreting, another doctor arriving, assessing, refusing, and turning away. The colonel's oxygen saturation was 62 now. Dangerously low. Barely compatible with consciousness. Dr. Mercer ordered the team to step back and prepare comfort care protocols, which was a clinical way of saying they were preparing him to die. Rachel stood at the bedside, her hand on the equipment cart. The room had the quality of a place where decisions had been made and no one could unmake them. 12 doctors. 12 refusals. 12 voices that had said no. Petty Officer Mitchell from the 455th stood across the room, watching her face. His eyes held a message that was old and deep and impossible to deliver in a place where people were trained to notice things. "Don't," his mouth formed silently. "Don't do this." She didn't move. Not yet. The monitors screamed their mechanical song. The colonel's chest rose and fell in the wrong pattern. And somewhere in the space between protocol and impossible choices, something was about to break. Dr. Mercer turned toward the door, assuming the narrative had already been written. He was wrong about that, just like he had been wrong about so many things. The next 60 seconds were going to change everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd spent 3 weeks trying to erase. The monitors screamed at 2 a.m. Not the gentle beeping of stable vitals, the shrieking alarm of a man whose oxygen was disappearing, whose heart was drowning in its own pericardial fluid, whose chest was collapsing inward like a building under demolition. Rachel heard it from the break room where she'd been standing alone with her hands pressed flat against the vending machine, staring at nothing, waiting for her shift to end and her invisibility to continue uninterrupted. The sound moved her before her brain caught up. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3 down the corridor. The crash cart was already rolling, the pneumatic hiss of its wheels, the metallic rattle of defibrillation pads and syringes and ampoules of epinephrine in their plastic wells. Dr. Mercer was shouting orders, always shouting, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all engine and no precision. The colonel's room was 30 feet away. Rachel was there in 18 seconds. The Air Force officer was arching off the bed, his face the color of slate, his mouth open in a silent scream because the air in his lungs was being crushed by a pneumothorax that had turned into something worse, a tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space, building pressure, collapsing the lung entirely, compromising cardiac output, killing him one breath at a time. His oxygen saturation on the monitor read 62 and was dropping. 60. 58. The numbers fell like a countdown to dead. Cardiac team, assemble. Mercer was already there, positioned at the head of the bed with the authority of a man who'd spent 3 weeks ensuring Rachel understood she had none. His hands moved with competent brutality, running the code, calling interventions, making decisions with the certainty of someone who'd never been questioned. Large bore 4, push 2 of epi, get me an X-ray and cardiothoracic consult immediately. 2 residents. 3 nurses. A respiratory therapist with intubation equipment. The code team assembled with the practiced efficiency of medical professionals who understood the choreography of resuscitation. One of them was Petty Officer Mitchell, the combat medic from the 455th, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Rachel where she'd stopped just inside the threshold of the room. He knew. Not why she was there, anyone could be there, any nurse could answer the code. He knew because he'd seen her hands on an 4-line 3 weeks ago, moving with a precision that didn't belong to someone who'd been working temp contracts. Because he'd whispered her call sign in the dark of the ward after recognizing her needle placement. Because he was looking at her now with the specific terror of a man watching a live grenade roll across the floor of a barracks. Charge to 200, Mercer commanded. The defibrillator whined, building voltage. The colonel's body jerked upward as electricity ran through his chest. The monitor showed asystole, nothing, flat line, the ultimate defeat. They started chest compressions. One nurse took over the rhythm, pressing down with mechanical fury, counting, 1, 2, 3, for another pushed medications. The room became a controlled emergency, a ballet of professionals fighting a patient who was already leaving. How long? Mercer's voice cut through the chaos. 8 minutes without perfusion, someone answered. 12 doctors came through the next hour. Rachel would remember this number with precision because she watched them arrive and then leave, one by one, their certainty hardening into resignation. Cardiologist. Interventional radiologist. Pulmonologist. 2 intensivists. A thoracic surgeon who was called from home at 2:11 a.m. and arrived at 3:19 still pulling on his white coat. Each one examined the patient. Each one reviewed the monitor strips. Each one looked at the advance directive framed in the family notification folder on the bedside table, the colonel's own signature authorizing them to stop if things became futile. By 4 a.m., all 12 had withdrawn their support. The rhythm won't convert, the thoracic surgeon said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd already made the calculation. For unsuccessful defibrillation attempts. No perfusing rhythm. Even if we achieve ROSC, the neurological prognosis is devastating. We need to consider what the patient would want. Mercer nodded with the solemnity of a man making the correct decision. I'm going to brief the family. Prepare for discontinuation of resuscitative efforts. The room began to clear. Residents peeling off gloves. Nurses stepping back from the bedside. The rhythm of compression slowing, then stopping. The code was ending. The patient was lost. This was medicine accepting its limits with dignity and precision, and it was also the moment that Rachel Torres, who'd spent 18 years being invisible, being overlooked, being dismissed as just another temp nurse nobody would remember, moved forward with hands that knew exactly what to do. Petty Officer Mitchell saw it first. Saw her hand close around the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her fingers finding it with the certainty of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts. His whisper came sharp and urgent, "Torres, don't." She didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge the warning. Didn't hesitate. Her left hand counted down from the colonel's clavicle, feeling for the ribs beneath his skin, finding the second intercostal space, the anatomical landmark that existed in muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Second rib. The space below it. Midclavicular line. Her right hand moved with surgical precision that had been learned not in a classroom or simulation lab but under mortar fire in Kandahar, stitching up soldiers whose names she no longer spoke aloud, performing emergency procedures in tents that smelled like diesel fuel and blood and the particular copperous stench of trauma. The needle entered between the second and third ribs. The hiss of air releasing came immediately, not violent, but profound, the sound of pressure equalizing, the sound of a lung being allowed to re-expand, the sound of a man being given back his oxygen. The colonel's saturation climbed. 62. 71. 83. 94 in 30 seconds. The numbers moving upward like an elevator toward consciousness. His chest rose. The monitors changed their tone from the flatline's accusatory silence to something almost like rhythm, not perfect, not stable, but alive. His eyes moved behind closed lids. His fingers twitched. Rachel pulled the needle, applied a sterile dressing with her left hand while her right hand was already moving toward the medication cart because she was already thinking 3 steps ahead, what the lungs need now, what the heart needs, what the protocol says next when you've just bought time that 12 doctors said was impossible to buy. Mercer spun around. His face underwent a transformation that would have been interesting to watch if it hadn't been so dangerous. Disbelief first. Then recognition. Then the specific crimson rage of a man whose authority had just been publicly obliterated by someone he'd spent 3 weeks ensuring understood she had none. "What did you just do?" His voice was very quiet now, which was worse than shouting. "Tension pneumothorax," Rachel said, her own voice level and flat and stripped of any apology. "Decompressed second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." His re-expanding. "You just performed a procedure outside your scope." Mercer's hand was already moving toward his pocket, toward the phone that would document this violation, that would weaponize Hospital Protocol 7-23AB against her, that would transform a life-saving intervention into professional malfeasance. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you comprehend the implications of what just occurred in this room?" He photographed the needle. The patient. Rachel's badge number. The surgical precision of someone building a file, creating documentation, ensuring that no defense could be constructed because the evidence would be overwhelming and ironclad. Protocol 7-23B prohibits unlicensed invasive procedures, Mercer continued, his voice rising now, his composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "This is immediate grounds for termination. Security will be notified. Incident report filed. The State Medical Board will be made aware of your violation of scope of practice." Petty Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command. "Dr. Mercer, she just saved his life." Mercer cut him off with a gesture, his attention never leaving Rachel. "She violated hospital policy. She's a nurse with no surgical training, no credentials beyond basic clinical skills, and she just performed a procedure that could have killed him had it gone wrong. Security. Now." Rachel stripped off her gloves and placed them on the bedside table. The motion was deliberate, slow, final. She didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't explain that the procedure was within the scope of emergency nursing in any critical care setting, that the ACLS guideline supported intervention when a patient was in cardiac arrest, that 12 doctors had already surrendered and she had simply refused to accept their surrender. She couldn't defend herself. Captain Rachel Torres, officially dead in a convoy accident in Kandahar for 14 years, officially erased from every database, officially non-existent according to every military record that had been classified and redacted and buried in Pentagon archives, could not afford to surface. Could not afford to have her name appear in an incident report that might trigger background verification. Could not afford to have anyone look too closely at the woman who could perform emergency thoracic decompression with the precision of someone trained in battlefield medicine. The prosecution would be immediate and absolute. The military doesn't forgive people who come back from the dead. They prosecute them. She walked out of the colonel's room at 4:13 a.m., her hands completely steady despite the specific gravity of what she'd just done, her face completely blank despite the knowledge that everything she'd built, the invisibility, the temporary contracts, the deliberate absence from the military healthcare system, had just collapsed in the time it took to decompress a single lung. Petty Officer Mitchell followed her into the hallway, his voice low. "Rachel Torres, whatever your name is now." "It's Rachel Torres," she said quietly, and kept walking. She kept walking down the hallway, past the nurse's station, past the supply closet where she'd once stood alone at 3 a.m. pressing her forehead against a shelf of 4 bags. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that sickly pale wash. The hallway looked like it always did, but the walls felt like they were closing in at 2 miles per hour, slow enough that she almost couldn't feel it happening. Petty Officer Mitchell caught up to her at the stairwell door, his hand up, palm out like he was trying to slow her descent. "Rachel," he started. "It's Torres," she said, not turning around. "Captain Torres. And you need to walk in the other direction. The Colonel's stable. O2 sat 94%. You saved his life in 30 seconds. I know how long it took." She pushed through the stairwell door and descended without waiting for him to follow. 12 flights down, she could hear his boots behind her for 3 flights, then nothing. He stopped. He understood. The kind of understanding that only came from having stood over wounded soldiers and watched the choices narrow down to either or, life or death, stay or run. The parking lot was empty at 4:13 a.m. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel as she drove the 12 minutes to the apartment on Ridgemont Street, the same apartment she'd rented under her current identity 2 years ago when the temp agency first placed her at Seattle General. The lights in her son's bedroom were dark. The kitchen light was still on. She'd left it on that morning before her shift, a small habit that meant she didn't have to navigate her own home in the dark. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs. The scrubs were still damp with sweat from the code. She could smell the bleach from the floor wipe, the copper undertone of someone else's blood, not the Colonel's, just the ambient residue of a hospital at 2 a.m. when the floors got cleaned between traumas. She sat without moving. Without thinking. Her hands rested on the table in front of her like they belonged to someone else, someone who had just pushed a 14-gauge needle between 2 ribs and felt the hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung, someone who had spent 14 years being invisible and had just made herself impossible to ignore. The clock on the microwave read for 56 a.m. when she put her face in her hands. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there with her palms pressed against her eyes, breathing in the smell of antiseptic that had soaked into her skin, thinking about the General Order No. 1 that had been read to her on a tarmac in Kandahar in 2009, "You will not speak about this operation. You will not disclose your identity. You will not contact military personnel. You will not surface in any database, government or civilian, ever again. The operation is classified. Your death has been recorded. If you violate these terms, federal prosecution will follow." She'd signed it in blood, literally, a symbolic cut across her palm and a print on the document, the kind of ceremony that meant they weren't joking. 15 seconds later, she was crying into her hands in her own kitchen, her shoulders shaking, the restraint that had held her upright for 14 years finally splintering like old wood. "I can't tell them," she whispered to no one. "I can't tell them." The words came out like a mantra, like a prayer to a god she'd stopped believing in somewhere between Fallujah and the 3rd time she'd held someone's intestines in their body cavity while waiting for medevac. "I can't tell them. I can't tell them. I can't tell them who I was." Her son found her that way at 6:24 a.m. He'd woken up early to get ready for school, probably heard her breathing in the kitchen, probably thought she was making coffee. 14 years old, still in his pajamas with a hole in the collar, his eyes going wide when he saw her sitting at the table with her face tracked in tears, her scrub stained, her hands shaking like she was standing in an Arctic wind. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Why are you home?" Rachel couldn't lift her head. Couldn't make her eyes work. She just kept her face in her hands and whispered the same thing over and over, the only truth she was allowed to speak. "I can't tell them. I can't tell them." "Tell who what?" His footsteps crossed the kitchen tile. He was scared now, she could hear it. A kid who'd grown up with a mother who never broke, never faltered, never showed fear, suddenly seeing something shatter. "Mom, what happened?" She couldn't answer. The words were there, locked behind 14 years of legal non-disclosure agreements and federal prosecution threats and the simple understanding that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Dr. Mercer was somewhere in Seattle General right now, probably in his office, probably pulling files from the medical record system with the precision of a man who'd spent weeks building a termination case that was designed to be airtight. 5 documentation violations. She could already see them, already knew how he'd framed them, a medication timestamp discrepancy that wasn't actually a discrepancy, an initial on a chart that he'd claim was illegible, a co-signature that he'd argue didn't follow Protocol 7-23b, the protocol he'd weaponized against her the moment she'd proven she could do something he couldn't. He'd been fabricating these violations for weeks. She'd seen his eyes watching her, cataloguing her work, waiting for something to weaponize. But she'd been careful. More than careful. She'd been invisible. And then she'd stepped out of the shadows for 45 seconds to save a man's life, and now everything was coming apart in a way that couldn't be put back together. By 8 a.m., Dr. Mercer had pulled her entire file from the last 8 weeks. By 9 a.m., he'd cross-referenced her medication orders with timestamps. By 10 a.m., he'd drafted the incident report and flagged it for immediate review by hospital administration. By 10:51 a.m., he'd added the needle decompression incident with a legal interpretation of Protocol 7-23B that technically could be read to prohibit a nurse from performing emergency procedures outside the direct supervision of a licensed physician. By 1 p.m., her phone rang. It was the HR director, the same woman who'd hired her as a temp 3 years ago without making eye contact or asking questions about her background. "Ms. Torres, we need to speak regarding your employment status. Can you come in immediately?" She arrived at Seattle General at 2:15 p.m. She'd showered. She'd changed out of the scrubs. She'd left her son with his grandmother with a lie doctor's appointment. "I'll be back by 5. The lie was the kind that felt like practice for something bigger, worse, more consequential. They met in HR, a small room that smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. The hospital administrator who sat across from her was not Dr. Mercer, it was someone higher up, someone who had the authority to make things official. There were papers on the table. There was a stack of her charts with highlighted sections. There was Protocol 7-23B printed out and highlighted in yellow. Due to the incident this morning involving an unauthorized emergency procedure and combined with several documentation violations discovered during our review of your charts, Seattle General has determined that your employment contract is terminated effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and credentials now." Rachel didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She didn't mention that Protocol 7-23B was routinely interpreted differently by different departments, that the medication timestamp they were citing was a rounding error in the system itself, that a needle decompression for a tension pneumothorax in a patient without a pulse was literally the standard of care in every emergency medicine textbook in North America. She couldn't defend herself. Because to defend herself would mean telling them that she knew emergency procedures inside and out, that she'd performed field thoracotomies under fire, that the hands they were accusing of practicing outside their scope were hands that had been trained by the Special Operations Command at the Naval Medical Institute, hands that had been certified to perform emergency procedures that made a simple needle decompression look like remedial first aid. She couldn't tell them that. She could only nod. Could only stand up. Could only walk to her locker in the break room and start removing the few personal items she'd allowed herself to keep there, a photo of her son from last year, a spare set of scrubs, a coffee mug that read a nurse's rock that someone had given her 2 Christmases ago. Petty Officer Mitchell found her there. He was on shift, still in his scrubs, his name tag reading Mitchell, cardiac surgical technician, the official reason he had access to every operating room and trauma suite in the hospital. His eyes went hard when he saw the locker open, the empty hangars. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been terminated." "On what grounds?" Protocol 7-23B violation. Documentation discrepancies. She didn't mention that the discrepancies were fabricated, that Mercer had built this case like a sniper builds a shot, from a distance, with precision, with absolute certainty of impact. He's been manufacturing this for weeks. So fight it. Mitchell's voice dropped. His hand reached out like he was going to grab her arm, then stopped, respecting the boundary. "Torres, you can fight this. Tell them what you did in Kandahar. Tell them." "I was ordered to disappear," she said quietly. "The operation was classified. Officially, I died in a convoy accident in 2009. Officially, Captain Rachel Torres doesn't exist anymore. If I surface, if I tell them who I was, the federal government prosecutes me for violating the terms of my discharge agreement." Mitchell's face went pale. He understood immediately. He'd served. He knew what Black Ops meant, what classified operations meant, what the price was for breaking that silence. So you're just going to let him destroy you? His voice cracked slightly. Just like that. She didn't answer. She just kept pulling things from the locker, the photo, the mug, a small first aid kit she'd kept in case of, she couldn't remember what. She'd built this locker carefully, deliberately, to contain nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would make her memorable. She was folding her spare scrubs when her son appeared in the hallway. He was supposed to be in school. He was carrying a showbox in his hands, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched like he was holding something together by sheer force of will. His eyes found her, found the open locker, found the things she'd removed. "Mom," he said, and his voice shook across 2 syllables. "They need to see these." She froze. Her hands went completely still. The showbox in his hands was the one she'd hidden in the garage, the one she'd told him 100 times never to open, the one that contained everything she'd hidden for 14 years. "Baby, no," she said, and it was the first time her voice had cracked since 4:27 a.m. "No, put that back." But he was already moving toward the nurse's station, where Petty Officer Mitchell stood absolutely motionless, watching the showbox like it was a live grenade. His hand moved before she could stop him. The showbox crossed the threshold first, her son's fingers wrapped around the cardboard like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Behind him, the fluorescent lights of Seattle General's locker room flickered once, twice, casting his shadow across the tile in stuttering increments. Rachel's hands froze mid-motion, a stack of folded scrubs suspended between the locker and a plastic bin. Her jaw tightened. "Not here. Not like this." "Mom, they need to see these," he said, his voice shaking in a way that made him sound younger than 14. Older than he should have to sound. Petty Officer Mitchell stood absolutely motionless 3 feet away, watching the showbox like it was a live grenade. His breathing didn't change. His posture didn't shift. But his eyes tracked the cardboard like a sniper tracking a target through scope glass. Rachel set down the scrubs. Moved toward her son with the measured calm of someone walking through a minefield. "That goes back home," she said quietly. "Right now." But he was already walking toward the nurse's station, where the day shift was clocking out, where the evening crew was settling in, where Petty Officer Mitchell moved with sudden fluid precision to intercept him, not aggressively, just positioning himself like a wall that happened to be in the way. "Son," Mitchell said. "That's not." The colonel's voice cut through the hallway before anyone else could move. He was supposed to be resting. Post-op, oxygen off, cardiac function stable. The monitors had been singing steady rhythms for 6 hours. But Colonel Air Force had been trained in tactical decision-making, and he recognized the weight of a moment when it was standing in his room. "Valkyrie," he whispered from his bed. Just that. Just the call sign, the one the 455th had given her during the Kandahar rotation, the one that meant she was the one who'd gone back when everyone else pulled out. The one who'd held the line. His eyes found the silver star first. It caught the light from the window as Mitchell set the box down on the nurse's station counter, each decoration arranged like evidence at a trial. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. Combat medical badge. The folded flag beneath them all, pressed into a rigid triangle, the way they fold them for the families of the dead. Rachel moved toward the station. Her son stepped back. Mitchell stepped back. The room had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped being a place where fluorescent lights hummed and 4 pumps clicked through cycles. The combat medic, not Mitchell, a younger guy named Halloway from the 455th support unit, the one who'd been working the evening shift, he opened his mouth. Closed it. Then opened it again and started to read, his voice steady in the way military voices become steady when they're reciting something sacred. For conspicuous gallantry under fire, Captain Torres performed emergency thoracotomies on 3 casualties while taking direct small arms fire, resulting in the survival of all 3 personnel and enabling the extraction of 11 additional combat troops from a compromised position in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Holloway's hands trembled slightly as he held the citation, the first time Rachel had seen him shake since the code blue 3 nights ago. Her actions under extreme duress and in direct violation of orders to stand down exemplify the highest standards of military medicine and personal valor. 3 words burned in that citation: violation of orders. The ones she disobeyed to go back. The ones that had gotten her officially erased. That was when the general walked in. 2-star. Desert camouflage uniform despite the late hour, despite the fact that he should have been at whatever command center generals inhabited when they weren't actively saving one of their colonels' lives. His presence changed the pressure in the room the way a door opening changes air pressure, and every person standing in that hallway, the day shift nurses, the residents who'd abandoned the colonel 6 hours ago, the orderlies restocking the medication carts, they all felt it. He moved toward the nurse's station with the kind of deliberate grace that came from knowing that every step mattered. His hand came up in a salute that seemed to exist outside of time, formal and absolute. His eyes moved across each medal like he was reading a map of a person's soul. Bronze Star with Valor, he said, his voice low enough that only the people closest could hear, but somehow everyone in the hallway heard it anyway. Purple Heart. 2 of them. He paused. Combat Medical Badge. His hand remained elevated, the salute unbroken. You saved more people than most officers save in a lifetime. Rachel didn't move. Didn't acknowledge. Her composure held like a dike against a rising tide, and the general seemed to understand that this acknowledgement was all she could accept without breaking something that had been held together through sheer force of will for 14 years. What happened next took exactly 72 hours. The investigation Dr. Mercer had initiated against Rachel, the one he'd filed the morning after the code blue, the incident report claiming she'd practiced outside her scope of practice, the documentation violations he'd been manufacturing for weeks, it triggered the standard protocol. Patient Safety Review. Chart Audit. The State Medical Board examiner assigned to the case, a woman named Dr. Sandra Hayes who'd spent 20 years investigating hospital fraud, opened Rachel's documentation first. And noticed something within 3 hours. The discrepancies weren't in Rachel's charting. They were in Mercer's orders. Cardiac catheterization scheduled that didn't match diagnostic criteria. A 72-year-old woman admitted with stable chest pain getting a left heart catheterization. A 61-year-old man with a troponin of 0.03 getting a coronary intervention. EKGs that showed no evidence of acute coronary syndrome, followed by orders for angiography using devices from one specific supplier, Innovative Cardiac Solutions, represented by a sales associate who'd been texting Mercer at 2 a.m. on 3 separate occasions. Dr. Hayes pulled 6 months of Mercer's cases. 63 catheterizations. Every single one medically questionable. Every single one using equipment from the same company. Every single one billed at rates that were 40% above standard reimbursement. The device company emails took 18 hours to subpoena. The wire transfers took another 24. An LLC registered in Mercer's wife's maiden name. $1.2 million over 18 months. Monthly deposits that align perfectly with procedure volume. The kickback scheme unraveled like a sweater with a single thread pulled. By the 72-hour mark, the State Medical Board had scheduled an emergency revocation hearing. By day 90, Dr. Mercer's medical license was gone. Seattle General terminated him for cause, nullified his pension, and referred everything to the FBI and the State Attorney General's office. The hospital issued Rachel a formal written apology, reinstated her with back pay, and offered her the position of Director of Nursing Quality Assessment with a $47,000 annual salary increase. She didn't accept it. Instead, she signed the acceptance letter for the VA hospital across town, where they needed someone who understood combat medicine, who could recognize trauma not just in bodies but in eyes that had seen things they shouldn't have seen. The VA Medical Center in Savannah had a 3-year backlog for mental health services and a veteran population that was drowning. Rachel could swim. 6 months later, someone from the old staff spotted Mercer at Savannah Community College. He was teaching a CPR certification course in a basement classroom that smelled like old carpet and disappointment. $18 an hour. His hands positioned a plastic dummy's head with the same mechanical precision he'd once used to demean residents during grand rounds. Tilt back, he recited in a monotone. Check for breathing. One of the pharmacy techs in the class, a young woman named Sarah who'd worked at Seattle General for 2 years, she remembered him. Remembered the way his voice could reduce a nurse to silence with a single sentence. Remembered the cutting remarks disguised as constructive feedback. Now he was correcting her hand placement on a plastic torso with that same condescending tone, but his voice carried the weight of a deflated balloon. The other students weren't even watching. One was scrolling through his phone. Another was drinking cold coffee and staring at the ceiling tiles. Sarah yawned deliberately, her jaw opened wide enough that Mercer could see the back of her throat. His mouth tightened. He said nothing. Resumed the compressions demonstration. A student raised her hand to ask if they got a break. Across town, at the VA Medical Center, Rachel stood in her new office in Class A uniform. The folded flag from Sergeant Chen, her radio operator, the one who died covering her escape when the compound had overrun, the one whose brother the colonel had known, was displayed in a shadow box mounted on the wall beside her credentials. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. A framed photograph of the 455th's Charlie platoon, taken 3 days before the operation went dark. A young veteran with a prosthetic leg sat across from her desk, his hands trembling slightly. TBI from an IED. PTSD from 6 months of convoy operations. The VA downtown had told him 6 months. The wait list was full. Rachel opened a file. "You're looking at the new Veteran Crisis Intervention Program," she said quietly. "We start today." She spent an hour with him. 3 more veterans that afternoon. By the following week, she'd established a protocol. By the following month, she'd hired 2 additional therapists and a peer support coordinator who'd survived a TBI himself. The combat medic from the 455th stopped by at shift change. "Colonel's being discharged tomorrow," Mitchell said, leaning against her doorframe. "Full recovery. He asked for you." Rachel visited the colonel's room at the end of her shift. He was sitting up, oxygen off, reading something on a tablet. When he saw her, he set it down carefully, the way soldiers set down weapons when they're in the presence of something that matters more. "I served with Chen's brother in Germany," he said before she could speak. "He told me what happened that day. How you went back for him." Rachel's jaw tightened. "I didn't get to him fast enough." "You got 11 others out," the colonel said. "Chen made sure you could." "That's what his brother told me." He said Chen kept transmitting coordinates, kept the incoming suppressed, gave you the window. The colonel leaned forward slightly. He said Chen knew he wasn't making it out. Made sure everyone else did. They sat in silence for a moment. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Outside the window, Savannah's evening traffic moved with the patience of a city that had seen everything, forgiven most of it. "What Mercer tried to do to you," the colonel said finally. "How'd you handle it?" Rachel considered. "I just kept working. Did what needed doing." The colonel smiled. "That's the only thing that matters in the end." Her son appeared in the doorway, backpack over his shoulder, waiting to drive her home. The colonel saw him and nodded slowly, with the recognition of someone who'd just understood the complete picture. "Your mom's a hero, son," he said. The boy looked at Rachel with new understanding. "I know." As they walked to the parking lot, Rachel put her arm around her son. The late afternoon sun painted the concrete gold, and somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed toward the ER at Seattle General, toward the doctors and nurses who were still learning what it meant to hold a life in their hands. Her son asked, "Are you going to tell me the rest?" "About Kandahar." Rachel looked up at the sky, then back at him. "Someday. When you're ready to understand that power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." They drove home as the sun set over Savannah, the VA hospital lights coming on behind them, each window a space where someone was starting to heal. If you found Rachel's story as powerful as we did, subscribe for more of these stories of quiet heroes and reckoning moments. Like and comment, tell us, have you ever underestimated someone only to discover they were extraordinary? We're reading everything.